his most popular novels. It has been feted, it has made shortlists, and it has won the Author Award in 2023. She's just come from Shillong. Her flight was 3 hours late. Oh, there she is. So, a big round of applause for her. And she'll be in conversation with Diya Kohli. Diya works in Condé Nast, India. She's currently the features director there, Condé Nast Traveller India. In her 15-year career as a journalist and editor, she has reported on a variety of topics for newspapers and magazines across India. Over to you, Diya.
Hi, is this audible? So, Janice, it's a pleasure having you here in Calcutta. And this is actually a very special venue because a part of your book is set here. We're also in the middle of this fantastic garden, which has over, I believe, 3,000 trees and over 60 species from around the world. So, I think it's a very apt setting for this conversation, for your book. And I think a good place to begin is with gardens. So tell me, was there a specific garden anywhere in this book which spans gardens around the world where there was sort of a seed sown or a moment?
That's such a lovely question and such a lovely way to enter the conversation. Thank you all for being here. It's just the most perfect setting. I mean, I always love being in Calcutta, always. But this is really, really just so spectacular. I don't know how you're concentrating on anything we're saying because, my God, I feel like turning around constantly. So stunning. I love that we're in a garden, and you're so right, Thea, because the book or the idea for the book, the seed of an idea for the book, um, grew in my head in a particular garden, in not very extravagant or noticeable garden. I was a student in the UK many years ago now, a decade ago, and I had journeyed out of London to Salisbury, I think, and had gone to see the cathedral. And around the cathedral, there was this garden space, and I was wandering around on a rather lovely, rare, sunny afternoon. And I noticed that there was an exhibition in this distant corner, tucked away. Um, and this was an exhibition on Victorian and Edwardian women botanists and their lives and their stories. And I walked around completely engrossed and completely intrigued because these women led the most unruly lives. They did exactly what they wished to at a time when, well, that wasn't particularly palatable to anyone else. Um, they had their own rules, really. They traveled the world at a time when it wasn't very easy for women to do that. And they were artists, they were botanists, they were plant collectors, of course. And I stood there almost dumbstruck in some way because this image of a woman grew in my head. And of course, in the book, she becomes Evie, our Edwardian botanist. But this image of a woman sort of took root, took shape. And all I knew was that she was journeying from London, from the UK to India on a ship, and she's bound for the unknown, and she's filled with the spirit of adventure, and she's looking for something. And I kept asking myself, what is she looking for? What is she seeking? What is this quest that she's on? And I love quest stories, as I'm sure all of you do. And in some ways, that spirit of inquiry and that spirit of questioning infused the beginning of the book. And I would like to think the book itself, right? It begins with that question, what is she looking for? And I'm not going to tell you for those of you who haven't read the book yet. Um, but in some ways, I had to write the book to find out what Evie was looking for. what her quest was.
I think this is a good time to actually read Evie's story as well as your other character, Shai, who is from present day Delhi, who travels to Shillong also in search of something. And it'd be nice to establish a little bit of context and read sections from their stories, and then we can move on from there.
Sure, sure. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I'll read Evie first, yeah? Since we've wandered into her territory. Okay. Super. Not at all. Um, so Evie is a botanist at a particularly fraught time to be a woman botanist in particular. Because of course academia and the halls of academia are very much constructed for men and the work that they do, and women and the work that they do were mostly dismissed and sidelined. So this is her thinking a little bit about botany, right? About the work that she's devoted her life to. What makes it so distressing is that botany had been their own for so long, the roots of which lay in herbalism, Agnes had told her, our oldest system of healing, and not in the many fanciful associations between plants and women in myth and literature. Who would tend to medicinal home gardens? Who would care for sick children and administer herbal remedies? Botany had been their own for so long, but no longer. Many heated discussions were had about this in her years at Newnham. Newnham is where she studied botany in Cambridge, usually in someone's room after dinner over cocoa and biscuits and a healthy helping of rebellion. The last inspired largely by the whirl of suffragette news around them. Women disrupting speeches at political meetings, unfurling votes for women banners in public spaces, but even in their quiet college, this spirit burned. Blame it on John Lindley, someone would say, dead and gone now, but in his time he was on a quest to defeminize botany. Who is Lindley? The younger girls would ask. And someone else would doff an invisible hat, puff out her chest, and march across the room announcing botany teacher, writer, institutional powerhouse, and first class prick. The room would erupt into laughter. Botany was also once seen, the older girls would explain, as an extension of flower arrangement and floral painting, as something merely for women to busy themselves with for entertainment and improvement. But when new disciplinary boundaries were established in academia, people like Lindley thought it imperative to separate what they considered polite botany from real botany, since nothing scientific and modern could possibly involve women.
And I also
Yeah.
want you to read the section on Shai.
All right. So Shai is a parallel character to Evie, and she exists in our very contemporary space. A little lost, a little bit of a wanderer. She's journeying back from Delhi to the Northeast, which is, where I come from. And she's journeying in particular back to Shillong, also my hometown. I promise Shai is not me. So let's get that out of the way very quickly. But she's on her way back, and I'll read you a little bit of her journey. Yeah? We land in a place that falls off the map, so far east in this vast country that it feels not of this country anymore. I emerge from Guwahati airport into ferocious heat and dust and a wake of clamoring cab drivers. I'm looking for Mohan, a guy from home who's meant to pick me up. We always hire him, though I'm not entirely sure why. He's busy on the phone for most of the 3 hour drive up winding mountain roads, and he chews alarming amounts of betel nut, intermittently opening his door while we're moving to eject a stream of red liquid onto the tarmac. All along, we leave a trail of little crime scenes. Thankfully, now he finds me. Ale, he says in Khasi, even though he is Nepali. and whisks my suitcase out of my hand. I follow him dutifully across the parking lot to a shiny white Sandro. The good thing about Mohan is he doesn't feel the need for conversation, apart from near monosyllabic questions. AC? Tea? Toilet? And so I watch as Assam passes by outside the window. After a traffic clogged section at Beltola, we drive through long, quiet stretches, fields edged by graceful palms, ponds choked prettily with hyacinth, and then we hit the truck heavy highway, also the border between the plains and the hills. Booze shops line the Meghalaya side on the right, where alcohol taxes are lower. On the Assam side, busy markets spill with colorful produce, backdropped by cement factories belching white smoke. All this is familiar. All this I have known all my life, etched into all the journeys I have made to and fro from elsewhere to home and back to elsewhere again. An oddly reversed ordering, I know, but home for me has always been a place not to live in, but to leave. Thank you.
So, the reason I asked you to read these two sections is because your book traverses four narratives. Two are fictional characters, women, they're Evie and Shy, both in search of things, both travel across the country, travel across continents. And on the other hand, you have the two very real, larger than life historical characters of Goethe and Linnaeus. So I wanted to ask you about the making of these two female characters and also telling their stories and telling them in a way that made these stories as important as those of figures that have already been written about.
Yeah, yeah. It was exceedingly important to find balance, to find resistance, all at the same time with this book, right? So, for those of you who may not be familiar with the structure of the book is structured as a nest, right? So, we begin with Shy, we move to Evie, we move to Goethe, we get to Linnaeus, and then we move right back outwards again, right? Goethe, Evie, and then we end with Shy. So, Shy's narrative embraces, cradles the other stories in the book. At the heart of the book is Linnaeus, a rather, um, what shall we say, um, unlikable character in many ways, but an important one because of the kind of point of view that he offers. Right? For those of you who might have studied science in school or university, you know Linnaeus, right? He was our sort of our taxonomist extraordinaire. He categorized and organized the world, the natural world. He gave us our botanical taxonomies, our botanical names. So he was very orderly and he saw the world in this deeply mechanistic, deeply analytical, deeply categorical way. So he lies at the center of the narrative because in some ways we still live in a very Linnaean world. We live in a world where we tend to categorize very easily gender, nation, ethnicity, who we are, where we come from, right? We like to fit things into little boxes. The rest of the narratives swirl around Linnaeus' story at the center, offering voices of resistance, right? This is a book, and this is not something that we've discussed very often in previous sessions, but I think it might be a good time to bring it up now. There is a simmering thread of ecofeminism that runs through this book very deliberately. It is about finding a softer, gentler, more compassionate, more collaborative way of being in the world, as opposed to something that Linnaeus offers, a way of being that Linnaeus and his ilk offer, which is deeply driven by the Enlightenment, for example, right? That places our species, for no good reason, the top of the evolutionary chain, right? That we are the darlings of creation and everything on this planet exists just for our sole, extractive and exploitative purposes, right? So, in some ways, Goethe, Evie, and Shai are kindred spirits. And it was important for me to do this because it doesn't matter so much whether, the character was male or female, but that they offered us a way of seeing that was different, that was far more embracive, that depended on, a way of seeing that called for unity and Catholicism um, and compassion and imagination and poetry, right? So Goethe, Evie, and Shai offer the voices of resistance to Linnaeus. But having said that, it was exceedingly intimidating for me to write not just Linnaeus, but also Goethe. So here I am from this little corner of the world, this woman, brown writer. You know how it is. We place ourselves also into categories because the world does so easily. And I thought, who am I to write Goethe into my book? He's this huge literary figure, huge cultural sort of icon. In some ways, Germany and him are almost interchangeable, right? It was exceedingly intimidating to write him. But somehow, you work through that, you overcome that, and what really helped was reading fiction where Goethe was deeply humanized, right? There were books like Daniel Keelman's Measuring the World, where Goethe strolls in for a line, says something that nobody understands, and strolls out of the page, right? So he's deeply humanized and even sometimes dealt with very irreverently. And that gave me a little bit of courage to write Goethe in a way that worked for me and for this story. But Shai and Evie, of course, hold this exceedingly special space within the sections of the book because they, more than anyone else, offer this spirit of curiosity and this spirit of 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 femininity, of a way of knowing, of gentler epistemology, right? Of being in the world in a way that is not intrusive and exploitative and extractive. Of They exist to shift or to try and shift our relationship with the world, to help us maybe ask these questions of ourselves, right? What is our relationship to our planet? So writing them, not easier because they are entirely in some ways fictional, and I didn't really have the kind of secondary and primary resources that I had with Goethe and Linnaeus. They are very, very widely written about, but they are exceedingly special. They're all very, very, important to telling the story, but they offer us this space of resistance, and they offer us this space to ask ourselves, how can we be differently? How can we learn about the world and relate to the world differently?
And I think that's evident, as you just mentioned, your telling of the story of Goethe as well, where there are diary entries, there are sort of insights into how he spent his day, letters to his beloved, to Charlotte. There's just like him walking around different parts of town, his interactions with the owner of a cafe, interactions with the musician on the street. There's just so much about him that humanizes him, lots of detail. But then there's the section of Linnaeus, which is the shortest section of the book.
Pretty
And
pages.
the form is really interesting. It's written entirely in poetry. So tell me a little bit about choosing that form to tell this part of the story.
Of course, absolutely. Thank you for
And maybe
asking
you
that.
can read that little section over there so I think people who are not familiar can get a sense of
Is it
just
this
what you've
one?
done with this section.
Sure. I love that you picked this one. So, Linnaeus, might I remind you, was an extraordinary list keeper. Okay? He made lists about people he thought were allowed to make lists, right? He was obsessed with making lists. So, if you read his texts, I don't think anybody really reads Linnaeus anymore. But if at some point you happen to pick up Systema Natura or Philosophia Botanica, you will see that all of his writing is in the form of lists. And I sat with these texts for a long while thinking, how on earth do I place these stories into a novel, right? But the thing with lists is that they look a lot like poetry. They sit on the page like poetry. They take, in some ways, the shape and form of poetry. And I thought, hang on, for a novel that's trying to challenge what our understanding is of the form of the novel, might I not place an entire section of poetry at the center just to shift the ground beneath your feet a little, just to maybe startle you and make you question, is this a novel? What do I call this if it's not a novel, right? So for a book that's trying to dislodge categories, the poetic form really did come to the rescue in some ways, right? It's sandwiched between all of this prose. But anyway, going back to Linnaeus and his lists, as I said, I looked at his texts and thought they look a lot like poetry. And I worked with his memoir, his travel memoir. He travels to Lapland. He was a very reluctant traveler, might I add. He hated traveling. And, it wasn't really that easy in 1732 either. But you could tell he was a person who preferred stillness, right? Who preferred to be in one place, sort of professing, right? But anyway, I worked with his travel memoir and I used, and some of you, if not all of you, might already be familiar with a poetry technique called erasure, blackout poetry, right? Where you work with a pre existing text and you intervene, right? You intervene with that text and you either black out sections of the text for a new work to emerge, or you play with the words, you play with the lines. And so that's what I did with Linnaeus's tour of Lapland. We danced, we tussled, we argued. I worked with his words and placed his diary entries, his journal entries into poetry. And the reason I also chose this particular form is that with erasure, you might end up with new work, but it's new work that's constantly haunted by the old. The pre existing text never ceases to exist. It's constantly in the shadow, in the background. And I thought for a world that is still haunted by Linnaeus, that is still haunted by Linnaeus's way of seeing, erasure poetry works rather well to bring that across, right? So I'm just going to read one little poem. Um, Linnaeus was also obsessed about who could be a botanist. So he made a list of all the people he thought could be botanists. Definitely not poets, by the way. How to be a true botanist. So, not just a botanist, but a true botanist. This much is clear. Have a real understanding of botany and know how to name all plants with intelligible names. Then be either two things, collectors or methodizers. The first concerned primarily with the number of species of plants, the second with the arrangement of plants and nomenclature. You see where this is going, right? The amateurs of botany are those who have produced various works about botany, though they do not properly pertain to botanical science. Anatomists, gardeners, physicians, and miscellaneous. These are no good, according to Linnaeus, which all fall economists, biologists, theologians, poets, without fail, studiously seek out the natural method of classification, for this is the beginning and the end of what is needed in botany. Remember, nature does not make leaps All plants exhibit their contiguities on either side, like territories on a geographical map.
So again, talking about Linnaeus here is very, very brave to take on a figure like this, especially from a person with a background in humanities and someone who's also probably referred to Linnaeus with an interest in gardening. You've discovered plants and their naming and their classification, perhaps through Linnaeus. So tell me about your relationship with him.
Contentious. Honestly, I started out thinking I'm truly going to dislike this man. And it's going to be so simple writing him because he's just going to be plain old unlikable. And then I read his memoirs. And yes, he complains a lot. He's a bit bossy. He likes to tell you what to do. He likes to think also that he knows it all, and that his way is the only way. His way is the right way. His way of organizing the world is the best. And no one else can do what he does. All of these. But he also shared with me this incredible wonder of the natural world. He felt awe and he felt love, and he walked through mountain paths with a sense of um, childlike wonder. And I connected with that. And I thought, oh, damn it. I thought it would just be so simple, but it's not. And in some ways, Linnaeus himself helped me realize that you cannot place people into categories. Not even Linnaeus himself, because he was so much more than just this taxonomer. He was so much more than just this obsessive list maker, than just this, you know, scientist. Um, he was a walker. He was a painter. He liked sitting by rivers. He wondered about reindeer. He named everything he saw. That's true, but he still observed very carefully. He paid attention to the world in his own warped way, but to pay attention, I think, always is to bestow love. And suddenly he became that much more complicated and that much more interesting. Suddenly, he didn't fit into this little box that I had created for him. And that taught me a huge lesson as a person and as a writer, that our characters are so much more than who we think they are, that people are so much more than who we think they are. You just have to look a little more carefully and spend a little more time looking at details.
So you mentioned just a little bit earlier that Linnaeus hated traveling, in fact, but hate it or love it, this is one of the things that all your characters do. They're always traveling throughout this book. They are either in boats or they're walking or they're taking flights, and they're traveling all the time. And there's this hectic pace, this urgency to reach somewhere. Everyone's in search of something. Everyone's out there looking for a particular story and particular sort of mission to fulfill. At the same time, there's this other time frame where there is this sense of stillness the moment they interact with the world of nature. So it's almost like the book is operating on two different time frames. How did you manage to sort of bring out the balance that work between the two and sort of keep engaging with both almost simultaneously throughout?
Oh my God, with a great deal of luck, I think. Oh, that's such a wonderful question. Thank you, Dia. You're absolutely right. Every section in the book, and there are four sections, they all begin at a point of departure. So Shai is leaving from an airport, Evie is at the docks, um, Goethe is secretly, leaving on a stagecoach. Linnaeus is setting out on foot. So of course, that kind of range of ways of traveling also takes us very much into that time, into that moment, into that point of history. And I think it was important for me that the characters travel because this is a book about movement in so many ways. It's a book about acknowledging movement in so many ways, right? It is about um, untethering, right? It's about allowing ourselves to acknowledge that the world is in constant motion, the universe is in constant motion, that all the trees and the plants around you that seem so still are moving. Even at the most cellular level, they are in motion, right? The universe itself at the atomic level is in motion, right? So movement, journeying, shifting, that is life. And so for my characters to be still, it didn't quite make sense. They had to be traveling. Of course, travel is also one of the richest, most convenient literary devices, right? It allows you to place your characters in certain situations that they would have never found themselves in otherwise. And travel reveals character, not just in fiction, perhaps in real life as well. Why do you travel better with certain people and not so much others, right? How do you travel as a person? How do you negotiate the immense variables that you are forced to negotiate with when you step out of the comfort and safety of your home? I feel as though how you travel reveals a lot about who you are. And I don't mean that in terms of, economic privilege. I mean in terms of psychology, who you are as a person. So my characters are forced to negotiate with newness, with unfamiliarity, with being displaced, with shifting. And how do you deal with that, right? What does it conjure up inside you? Because to travel, to move physically, outwardly, is to also travel inwardly, right? John Muir has that beautiful line where he says, to go out is to go in. But it's also important, and I think perhaps this is what literature offers us, this kind of moments, readings. You cannot appreciate the movement without moments of stillness. You cannot appreciate the stillness without those moments of travel. Right? So it was really important for them to find those moments of peace, and we usually have them back since the living world, the world. We usually find what communing something forest with the field, with the mountains, with the river, the tree. I find kind of stillness, the kind of silence, quietude are in this spaces. And so we hopefully can appreciate that. You cannot have one relentlessly, I mean, because it will tire you out as much as it does the characters. And so it's so important for the massive impact to bring that point to reflect, to say, what have I learned? Could I have done differently? What may I take away from this? Right? So just those moments of pausing reflection. Also, it's really interesting that he wrote a large part of this book during the pandemic when people were shut down. And we didn't know whether we were going to travel to the end of our streets, much less to other countries or other continents. At this particular point in time, you wrote about all these places in such staggering detail, down to the last dish in particular cafe in down to the minor characters sort of take on a particular historical monument. All the journeys are chronicled in such minutiae. I want to know how you sort of did it for the time when you were stuck indoors, and what was your
What do you pull back on for research? How much of this was based on your travels and how much of it was based from obviously diary entries? How did that question? Yes, yeah. You're so right. I wrote so much of this during a great moment of stillness, constriction. I was lucky enough pretty much done with the research that took me furthest away from home. So I managed to travel with a lot of help and support from parents and the institution where I teach, at Shaka. I was very privileged to be able to travel to Uppsala, where Venice, there's houses that I traveled to Goethe's room, to be abducted from the and I got on for another was in Italy and Rome, following Goethe's footsteps when the country went into lockdown. And, it was a strange time to be in Rome. It was really a lot of stress. But I made it home somehow. That's a topic for another session altogether. What a story that was. But I made it home somehow and then found ourselves in this environment of great constriction and great confinement. It would travel the spaces I write about in Shire's story, spaces closest to because I didn't want to travel to these very rural, very isolated areas in case we took this book. We had to be very, very careful. So I relied a lot on reportage, with articles, journalistic articles, and documentaries. Uh, I was hoping Delhi, little, little background. I was very, very lucky to have access to a small green space just outside ground floor apartment. And I had a few potted plants there. So usually a garden would come in and take care of. Because it was lockdown, he could come. So he would find on me to keep these plants alive. I was terrified, but somehow managed to, water them correctly and try and have these conversations with them. What do you need today? Do you need a little more sun? Do you need a little more shade? Me something. I know this sounds cliche perhaps in some ways, but being in the garden and being in the study from this first recollection, each fed me in different ways. They each nourished me in different ways. And they nourished each other. They fed into each other, perhaps because I was writing a book about our relationship to the natural world. I was slightly more attuned, I was slightly more attentive to what's my need, more attentive to my green space. I was thinking about the natural world. I was in which direction these relations in those directions. But I realized plants in my garden, they might be still, but usually not mobile, they're not drastically mobile. Some ways they are intense connected, would respond to a shift in season, would respond to rain, to light, to shade. They were in tune with something much larger, and everywhere they transformed. I watched a monster relief prefer for a fortnight and thought, this is miraculous. Every day it looks different. And I thought, for all of us who, of course, are privileged enough to be in safe spaces, to be in homes, to have so far help, despite the restriction, despite the restraints, there is still transformation. There is still connection. There is still movement. And in that stillness, and I played the writing of the book to see, okay, you really need you really need to get on that piano because sometimes I need to just be still and connect to the very beautiful way. So you just mentioned hope. times. What was Delhi for you when you were still back in DU? Was it DU states you grew up in when you were young in Shillong and Assam? What was London? Was in Shillong? And it keeps changing this definition of home for you. So, how has this changing definition of home across the years changed you as a writer? Gosh, such a good question. Yeah, I think because I come from a particularly turbulent part of the country, politically turbulent part of the country, the past few decades or more, it's always been a little precarious. Right? I hear all of these stories about the Northeast, etc. I'm not going to repeat them here because they're there, all too there. But I grew up in a generation of men who were pushed to be outside. Outside where it didn't matter. Shakya, that's the Khasi word for home. Right in your boomers, your parents, your grandparents thought that you would always have a better life, so that you would find a job, that you could make a living, that you could study better, that you could some kind of success. Also, because here, wherever that was in the Northeast, was not enough. It was never enough because it was lacking in infrastructure. There were no employment opportunities. Schools, universities were scarce for sort of few and far between. And what do you do after that? There's militancy, there's curfews and guns and guns. You need to right? So if you were in Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, that was good. If you were outside in a white country, even better. So this was the narrative that was fed to us for a very time. Me and so many others. And we all left. We studied outside. We found jobs outside. We found love outside. We tried to build a life elsewhere. And only during the pandemic, during lockdown, that so many of us, wasn't just me, that so many of us returned. And in some ways, this was a very important homecoming because it was home for a period of time in a way that had never spent. Sure. I had nowhere to go. I had nothing to do. I had provide, yes, but not much else. And it was a rediscovery of it was a returning homecoming. I walked through the forest. I trekked through the hills, through the mountains. I ate raw food. Made friends or remade, old friends. And suddenly I discovered that this place is nothing enough. The narrative slowly, I had, and so many others like me, unfurled, unraveled, and was replaced with new stories. Yes, this is what we've been told. There is a way to come back and to write the stories of these heroes in a way that I had never I'd never written this book if I hadn't done what I did. This book is very much about relationship us to the place that we call home, but to the planet, to the earth as our is our tree. So what did it mean to have the relationship to aim to begin with? I wouldn't have if it wasn't for this long trajectory of going away, returning. But at the start, we're back on roots on land because home is where stories came from. Home is where a new language sort of emerged. You discovered you would write about these events where very often a new word that you discovered, a new flower that you discovered, a new dish that you discovered or experienced in the cherry blossoms for the first time. So it was a long journey back home. It's not only with this book, it started way back with Burton and yeah, so it was because you're right, this book, I would feel like touches returns to the landscapes and the themes families of Bhutan lands. I think after Bhutan land was published, I was so concerned about categorized as a writer from the Northeast, as a woman writer from the Northeast, telling stories only about the Northeast. And these kind of expectations really weighed me down. And these expectations came from all sorts of places, from publishers, from editors, from readers, other writers, most ill intentioned stories. I wanted more, and I had to be more grateful for that we received so warmly, so generously. I think for me, it was really important to also be able to look like this literary landscape in a way that I wanted in places through life. The most policed way. And we can't do that across political borders. We can't wander into other countries. We have passports and visas. I didn't want that for my literary landscape. Wanted to be able to travel freely at will for a story, where it no matter where it comes from. But at some point also to choose where to return, right? To be able to choose where you would like to tell these particular stories about home. You don't have to constantly book about a particular place or a particular community, but you can also choose when you do that because of the way that it reflects your own life or the kind of space that it occupies in your own life. I spent a lot of time, I think over the last 1 year, doing this right at the edge of a playing forest. Your writer's book. So can you imagine in your space as a writer, space where you want to write your next book, or is this your actual writing? Or I think stars Singh said, there are no ideal conditions under which to write. You just write when you can. So I think it's the sort of spirit that I give Chanel because I did just leave Chanel today. But if there is good energy, there's creative energy, it's a good place. That's very important. If you can, whenever I get to a hotel room, a friend's place, a rented space, the first question I ask myself is, can I write here? And if I, if I say yes, if I feel that it says yes, then I'm perfectly at home. If I can't, I feel not at home. So that really travels with me up and gives them right? Shalom is God's heart, God's the sprawling the tree we want to sprawl. We want to reach for the sky. We want to travel, you know, uh, as far as we can, if only because we are strong and steady. Right? I think I want to most of what people we have is of questions. Last time I was just to tell a story. You started as a poet, maybe essays, you worked as a journalist for a publication. So what made you turn to fiction and to prose? What was that first impulse to tell that story? I think because I grew up within a community of storytellers, storytelling has always been a part of my life. Possibly before I could articulate or speak. I've been told stories like so many of us have, right? Being listeners to begin with, or born listeners. But within Shillong, within sort of the Khasi community, storytelling to sit with Mukana is an exceedingly important pastime. It's not even just a pastime. It's, part of how people connect, how people share, carry on, stories about people, especially in gatherings like funerals, where you talk about the past. So to tell stories is to keep people alive, to keep knowledge alive, to keep history alive, identity alive. So for me, I think the reason why it also began with poetry is because of these overall storytelling. Because to tell stories orally is to be very aware of how you're telling a story, how your words, where your pause, where your silences are, where you make a observate, when to take a breath, right? So poetry, because of its lines, like meter and rhyme, people, is such a natural inclination, such a natural sort of space for some ways to be working in. But I do find that I enjoy the expanse of prose, particularly expressive novel. It allows me to kind of interpret released space. I really crave for I can breathe with this of trying to immerse yourself into that story, into that space. Childhood, childhood, I was having a similar conversation with said writing a novel because just the first time writing a novel was immersing myself in a body of water. You completely sort of immersed in it and emerging a new person. I thought it was such a lovely way to put it because that's exactly how it felt with plants, especially this. It, it allows me that immersive space. I enjoy it so much. I think even then, even when I'm working with films, I'm still very aware of how words are made. Silences. What you say, what you say. So we're constantly trying to build these bridges between polarity, the sound, the script, text, so that it has a very live way that I write. And going to end is this section from the book, which is one of my absolute favorite sections, which is a storytelling session in this tiny village in Meghalaya, where it seems to have changed since, yeah, which is not true. In this particular section, it's sort of first patient. It's an absolutely stunning section, and it's such a moving bit about the art of storytelling. Yeah, so, so happy to read this video even for all of you. This is the lockdown of each storyteller of the world. Kaya up, kaya snap, which in Farsi means it is wait, it is listen. Kaya up, kaya snap, he begins. What story shall we tell tonight? This is a trick whispers Bluntry into my ear. He always pretends to ask, but he's decided already. Tonight, we shall tell the tale of creation, Hannah sanctified and true. Beginning, there was nothing but emptiness. God created human earth, the guardian of the spirit of the earth, who has lived happily, and soon began to long for the company of children. He is praying to help. footwear. Bless us with a chant or two so our line may continue. And after many such pleas, granted them their wish 5 times over. The sun, their first daughter, their only son, the moon, the water, wind, fire, who all grew up into beings of great accomplishment and shaped the earth with grace, beauty, gave life to mountains and flowers and trees. Do you know, says the monk now, singing, something is missing. Someone who would tend and sow and harvest, who would walk the earth looking after birds and beasts. None of this sun and the moon, the busy roving in the skies, water could not travel freely. Wind and fire ran too fast, too wild. Please prayed may one go and offer to our God that way. Send us someone who would not only be there to all his bounty, but also be steward of the world. Who did, who did, who did what they said about us? What disappeared, children shout in reply. Powerful spirits of the mountains, brothers who once stood next to each other on the road to Mount Ware. As it turns out, they keep too busy quarreling, squabbling between themselves to see to the welfare of other living things. And so our God sent the tiger, ferocious, grand tiger was a dust terrifying overlord who began a rule of tyranny and fear. Eventually, eventually, it was decided none but the 16 clans living in heaven would be fitting caretakers of the earth. For them, they created a golden ladder, loops up between to the center of the sky, thinking the kingdom of God, the kingdom of man. And for many years, there was great happiness, contentment, but darkness, violent, terrible greed and selfishness everywhere outward as they swerved away from the earth of goodness and truth. So he planted a tree, a special divine tree, as evidence of his displeasure, to mark the end of the years of joy and light. He planted again a tree of pain and shadow, the tree of the trees, which grew so huge that its branches covered the sun and the world into darkness. Instrument trying into the night as his voice rises and falls with the music. We sit, listen carefully. Three beings against me. I being against man. From a long while we do not move. For everything, everything was time. Just beautiful. We open up for questions now. Hello? Yeah. Hi, and congratulations for such a lovely session. And thank you. And once again, welcome to our city. Uh, yeah, thank you. Uh, actually, uh, observing the way you have engaged water in your writings, be it yours or or any kind of text you have written, it's fascinating. And for the imagination that flow of water. And congratulations for that. As a writer, you created space and a reader can enter and can imagine a lot of things. But it's not that question. It's just I want to know as water also is what your own emotions and feelings. What do you like to say? Thank you. And I can't just place an honor. Water and mist and rain is part of our lives every day. Uh, So it's impossible not to feel the presence of water very, very deep. For me, that surprise our community is still so deeply alive in so many ways because it echoes the fluidity of time. the shape shiftingness of water, multiplicity of forms that water can take is multiplicity of forms that reality takes as well, right? Text is it's a I guess for us. Sure, water at all its forms plays just the most integral part of life in a black hole. Um, as rain, of course, over the monsoon, which you all, of course, also experience here, but where I come from, it's that and tenfold. Mist, more than water was rain, it's mist that lingers through the air. So even the driest of winter afternoons, the night mist traps itself over the hills. I think that's happened in the plains as well. You see that with the paddy fields, and it's so beautiful, right? Our mist is little more tangible and it sort of holds us out here and constitute the ferocity that hadn't quite anticipated. But for your question, thanks. Different. It's an extreme honor to meet you. It's rather a personal for the work. We found it very peaceful case. We got around four different details and the story unfolds. It's based on so this time is based on 19th century novels. I really love. In was maybe not for everyone's professional, but I find it really very good. Okay. This is set up in this modern contemporary style. Yeah. Thank you. It spans 4 centuries, so the contemporary is part of it. One of my favorite authors. It's an extreme pleasure. Thank you so much. Anything else? This one. Yes, this is Aditya. But we felt like kind of audio producer, right? So like also an exciting said last year. So when I heard it, I was like, well, uh, a few days and I came across your book at Oxford and flying your desk out and I thought here I've been speaking is book, right? Because you're right, it's a poetics that I've been able to show. So considered actually going the performance like because you were the tradition, like if you look at Mahabharata, period, Odyssey, and if it came from poetry, right? And it was an oral tradition, and from there came the writing. Now, if poetry and poetry, the prose of it's a different dimension. When you when you do like celebrate yourself or somebody reject. So, what are your thoughts on like taking this performance? Love to. I mean, there's no, there's no two ways about that. I would love to be storytelling the most tangible way. Who knows? You know, these opportunities might come up. I would be more than happy to, yeah, to actually tell stories. Just trying to, reading, reading them out on occasions such as these, which I also enjoy very much. Yep. Getting the fullest. Well, here's to the road ahead. It's all your time. Thank you today. Thank you for a lovely session. Thank you so much, and thank you to you for being here on a chilly evening. It's really chilly. But really, thank you so much for your patience and for your just the right questions. Thank you.